Hi, everybody, and welcome to Literature Out Loud. Thank you for joining us again to hear the wonderful words of Joe Henry being presented for you by two of the wonderful residents of the Roaring Fork Valley, Lee Sullivan and Dr. John Cook. And they're both eminently qualified to read Joe Henry's words. Joe lives in Woody Creek, and he has a background in ranching and in laboring and in literature and in lyric writing. His words have been sung by Garth Brooks and John Denver and a whole bunch of other people. But he really knows the ranching life, and Lee is living the ranching life as well as doing work for Hudson Reed Ensemble as well as other places. And John Cook is a veterinarian, for Pete's sake, so he knows what he's talking about as well. They're wonderful readers, and we're lucky to have them. And they're going to be reading the first two chapters of Joe Henry's book, Lime Creek, which is wonderful for a whole lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that it works as a complete piece, but each of the chapters stands alone as a short story. If you haven't read it, I hope these two chapters inspire you to do so. And with that, I would like to introduce Lee, who's going to be reading Angels, followed by John Cook reading Family. Lee, would you please grace us with your voice?
I would love to. And so it begins. Angels. She came on the train with her folks, Spencer says, for the waters, for the mineral hot springs in that part of the state. Her daddy suffered from the lumbago, and in those days it was thought to be a cure. And two, the journey would be another facet of her education before she went back to one of those Eastern girls' colleges. She was 19 years old. Of course, I was young too, 20, and fixing to go back to school myself, which was my book learning. But I still knew the horses better than anything else. That summer, I was breaking rough stock on a great big spread at the foot of the Wind Rivers, while my own folks were still busy with their hay back home, which was maybe 60 or 70 miles to the north. You know, I'd rather be bucking broncs than hay bales any day that the sun comes up. I've been able to talk sense to animals, especially the horses, since I was a boy. And in the early evenings, when her folks had retired before dinner, Elizabeth had come out by herself and watched me working the unbroke creatures in the big corral. The red disk of the sun is setting directly in my eyes whenever I look up from this lovely 2-year-old bay colt that I'm working. And every so often he'll snort and tense and prepare to throw me away from him, with my left hand smoothing down his neck and my right arm resting over his withers. Keep talking to him, rubbing him softly up and down the bridge of his nose, and he snorts again, but still doesn't jump away, because by then he already knows that he likes the sound of my voice. And who knows how long I stand there like that, with my hands on him, speaking softly, and all the while watching his eye and his ears, which go from wanting to lie back and get away from me to coming forward again so we can hear what I've got to say. His brow lifts up real nervous-like, and he snorts again, and his eyes big and showing all white. Then, for whatever reason, he glances at me one more time, looks away like he's finally figured out that I'm not going to be a danger to him. So maybe he can ease down enough inside his fear to allow how good my touch feels too. It's full on dusk, and I'm still talking to him, rubbing the corners of his mouth as I position myself where he can look into my eyes whenever he wants to. But by now, I can see that he's decided to trust me. I always carry this length of braided rawhide that my granddad had given me when I was a boy. I take it out. I let him smell it and taste it, too, as I slowly move it past his teeth. And then I make one turn around the back of his lower jaw, Indian fashion. I rub his back down from his shoulder, talking all the while, and leaning against the barrel of his body with more and more pressure until he's actually supporting my full weight. He walks ahead a few steps with some concern, because by now I'm pretty much hanging off him with my arms across his back. He stops, and I leave my right arm over him, holding both sides of the rawhide rein snubbed up in my left hand, and without altering the calm assurance of what I've been telling him, I slide up and onto his back. He locks his knees, starts to hump up his spine, and his ears begin to come back and then go forward again. He snorts and kind of bounces once or twice, stiff-legged like that, and then just relaxes, walks me over to the fence, where Elizabeth is perched up on the top railing, watching us with this funny expression on her face. Not hard, but not smiling either. In a green sweater. I'll never forget that green. A green coat sweater. Isn't that foolish after all these years? Back across the dark, the clashing of the iron triangle calls everyone to come and eat. The hands at one long table, and the foreman and his family and the guests of the ranch at another. Elizabeth walks a pace or two ahead of me as I come up behind her, coiling my piece of rawhide. She turns when I get alongside and says, "They always seem to trust you, don't they?" And I say, "Ma'am?" And she says, "The horses. They trust you because you don't try to trick them, do you?" It's too dark to see your eyes, and I say, "No." I just put myself in their place until we both seem to understand what the other's thinking. "Well, I think they're lucky," she says. And I say, "Ma'am?" And she says, "The horses. I just think they're lucky." As we approach the wide veranda, I mumble, mostly to myself, I guess, "Well, I reckon I probably am too." We don't really get to talk again, for their stay is at an end, and the following morning they're bound back east. And in a few days, I'm headed home myself, and then back to school in Cambridge, in Massachusetts, of all places. As they say, the die seems to have already been cast without me understanding or even being aware of the wheels that had been set in motion a long time before I looked up like that, squinting into the setting sun, probably smelling not unlike the dust and rank horsehide of my then present occupation. For I'll soon be taking my own train ride in the same direction too. And I remember my father and me leaving a little after 3 a.m. for Cheyenne, where the railhead's at. My last night home, my mom comes in while I'm still packing, sits on my bed watching me choosing from the stack of clean clothes she's brought that are all folded perfectly like a pile of books, still warm and soft from her ironing. Without looking up, as I'm arranging everything in my case the way I want it, I say, "You know, I met a very lovely girl down at the White Cross Ranch, and I think I'm going to marry her." When the words come out and open like that so they can't be taken back, with my ma sitting on the corner of my bed for a witness, it shocked me even more than her. It scared me, too. I have to say, because I haven't had time or maybe just the courage to dwell on it. But to tell the truth, when I heard those words myself, spoken right out loud as if I was just repeating what had already been signed and sealed and delivered, even though I hadn't stopped to wonder if Elizabeth had gotten the same message too, like as if it was already settled and a complete thing, although it hadn't hardly even begun yet. "Ma," I says, "I met this beautiful girl, and I'm going to marry her." South Station in Boston, early Sunday afternoon, and then back again from Connecticut on the last train north every Sunday night, all through the winter, with me in my old hat and even older sheepskin coat that was permanently soiled from years of working and feeding animals in it. Seeing that I probably wasn't to be deterred by obstacles or distance or weather, her folks weren't all that happy with me as a prospective suitor for their younger daughter. Student in good standing at one of the world's great learning institutions, I was still, by their lights, an interloper in a cowboy hat who walked bow-legged and in strange boots and talked like he came from a foreign country, which Wyoming surely was, even though they had a recent taste of it compared to the neat and familiar coastline of their Puritan upbringing and forebears, where they had lived all their lives beside the constant ocean, with Boston to the north and east, and New York City to the south and west. Well, February roars in, and New England, or at least that part of it, is being battered by what they call an old-fashioned nor'easter. Gale force winds and nearly 2 feet of snow. They closed down just about everything from New York to Boston, excepting, of course, the trains, which are still running, although on a greatly reduced schedule. Elizabeth says they're midway through their dinner, each of them at least a little preoccupied with the wild sounds of the storm, that if anything seems to have gotten worse. Mr. Putnam glances down the table at his 2 daughters and says to Mrs. Putnam, "Well, hearth fire will be a welcome place on a night like this. Carrots, please, dear." And Elizabeth says that something makes her turn and look around. And her mother says, "It's just the oak limb against the roof, dear." And excusing herself, Elizabeth rises and hurries toward the front entrance where, whatever it seems, to knock once again. Standing there, all crusted with snow, she yanks me into the foyer with the wind blowing the snow in too, and then shoves the door closed behind me. She doesn't say anything while she wipes the snow from my face and helps me unbutton my coat, for it's at least a 3-mile walk from the train station, and I never have gotten into the habit of wearing gloves, I guess. She says, "Don't you have any sense at all?" And I say, "Ma'am?" And then, "You mean this little perturbation of wind and weather?" Now, this is the first time since I left home that it seems that maybe I really could almost get used to the climate here. Like Paul always said, of horse sense would help a jackass be a mule. Well, nary a man could do any better. She's standing there, trying not to keep from shaking her head with her mouth set and that look in her eyes that is not quite scolding yet. And I say, "Besides, I wanted you to marry me." Something in her eyes changes while she tugs on either side of my open coat, with her fist against my chest and my back against the door. The snow just beginning to melt onto her arms. I say, "Will you?" She looks into my eyes and just barely tips her head, but nowhere near actually to nodding, and whispers, "Yes." And I just remember saying, "Well then," with the doorknob still in one hand and my hat in the other. Without thinking, or perhaps a bit stunned too, along with everything else, I opened and closed the door behind me, lurching down the stairs, back out into the night, with the wind driving the snow under my open coat, and my hat still clutched in my hand as I lumber off into the darkness. I wonder what in God's name would have just done. I shared rooms with Jeffrey Stewart Coolidge III, and he lends me his old Plymouth, pressing the keys into my hand, telling me that I don't have to take a train to my own damn wedding. This is early in the spring in April. There are already buds in the trees. I remember thinking how back home there's still at least another good month of winter to go, April the 10th. I leave Cambridge early in the morning with my plan already in hand. For the day before, as I'm studying Coolidge's roadmap, I notice the name a little ways north of New York City, symbolism of it, or irony, or whatever somehow beckons me because I really had no idea where we should do this thing. Elizabeth was watching for me out the window, and as I pull up in front of the house, she comes down the walk with that little overnight bag. It's over her arm, wearing that same green sweater. It made me glad when I saw it, because it helped me forget some of my own nervousness as I recalled her setting up on that corral rail in the last of the twilight. I'd gotten that 2-year-old colt gentled and tentatively under control. As planned, neither of her folks nor her sister were at home. So we were off, headed for western skies. She gets in and hugs me around the neck, tipping my hat off and to the back seat where she'd placed her things. Coolidge had made me wear one of his fine suits with a necktie and vest, still preventing me my boots and hat. So at least I'd have something I was used to and familiar with, fall back on in case the realization was about to take place started me to doubting either myself or my prospects. But Elizabeth is just plain excited, with her arm through mine, pressed up beside me as I drive on, both of my hands gripping the steering wheel like a life preserver, watching straight ahead, hoping to God that we're doing the right thing. Even though I knew all the way back in September when I said it to my ma that we were. We passed a signpost directing travel toward New York City, go off on a different road. Elizabeth asked me if I know where I'm going, and I said, I think so. And she says, where? And I say, Valhalla, real serious like, as if it were the standard and expected destination for anyone bound on such a mission as ours. She says, Valhalla. And I say, yes, ma'am. Valhalla, New York. This is probably the single most foolhardy, if not, say, risky undertaking of my young life. Even considering all the other unpredictable and untamed animals I've ever been associated with. Valhalla, I read somewhere, is where they take the dead heroes. We arrive early in the afternoon, and I remember thinking again how mild it was. For I just naturally compared all weather in its season, all fixtures of geography, wherever I happened to be, to what it would be like if I were back home. Anyway, we drive on to where someone directed us to the town hall. We go into the information office, and the woman there she sends us over to the revenue office. The clerk doesn't look up from his desk until I say, excuse me, I'd like to buy a license. And he says, what kind? Dog, fishing, or marriage? For he sold them all. And I say, no, marriage. And then I ask him where I can find a justice of the peace. And he says, there's only one. And he's the presiding judge at the trial. He's the justice of the peace too. And it's this address. Now he writes something on a slip of paper and hands it over to me and says, it's walking distance. As we leave and proceed toward the main entrance, he calls after us, good luck. It was one of those big county co-op stores that seemed to have a little of everything. Burlap sacks of feed and seed and shelves of hardware and paint. And along one side, utensils and brushes and brooms and shovels. Then more shelves of canned goods, amongst bits and bins of nails and tools, and probably whatever else you could think of too. But for the most part, the floor has been cleared and then rearranged with parallel rows of folding chairs, like a theater, with an aisle down the middle. And it looked like the whole town sitting there. We were holding each other's hand as we stepped inside, and everyone turns around to see what just had come through the door, because apparently the trial was just then right at the height of its emotional intensity. And the judge, a little man with a bald head and a modest mustache and spectacles, he looks up at us from the table where he's sitting way down front and says, what do you want? Some truck driver had accidentally killed a woman in the wintertime, and he was on trial for causing her death. We're standing there with our backs against the door like a couple of greenhorns. young and obviously uninitiated, still in the rigors and snares and burdens of it all. Elizabeth squeezes my hand and presses into me. As I look down the blank sea of grim faces all turned about and staring at us, the little man, who's obviously in charge, leans over his hands and peers over the top of his spectacles. With a trace more of impatience and sternness, too, he says once again, "What do you want?" And I remember thinking how the smell of linseed oil and turpentine is the same everywhere. From that place where I'm standing and where I have never been before, all the way back to home. Maybe a little too loudly when it comes out, I answer, "We want to get married." Once again, in almost perfect unison, the faces all turn back around to the front. Their questioning and perhaps disapproving frowns transforming instantly and however reluctantly to the unmistakable beginnings of smiles for which they had no reason during all the prior proceedings. The judge nods his head one time and says, "Okay." And then drawing back from the table and standing, he says almost gently, "Come down here, young people." We walk down the center aisle through all those strangers still holding hands. There's sawdust on the floor and what looks like a spill of flour, a definite smell of brine from where two great wooden barrels sit behind the judge's table. And I think I can almost smell that dry, sharp taste of fresh cheese. For along with everything else, I'm also powerful hungry. Somehow, the moment has overtaken both of us, so we each know right there and then that we are absolutely and unquestionably where we are meant to be. With all our nameless neighbors in their crowded pews, and with the judge, we found out later was really a furniture salesman, waiting for us with his open hands raised and held out before him like a kindly shepherd of the flock, ready to send us off in the right direction. The blessings of all those who were assembled. Something has transformed the congregation, too. One moment, for 3 hours previous at a murder trial, one of their own accused and aggrieved, along with the victim's bereaved family. And with the opening and closing of a door, the entrance procession of two very young and somewhat abashed strangers who have appeared inexplicably in their midst. For some reason that is only their own, unexpectedly, they have now also become witnesses at a wedding, forcing them instantaneously from the dull, somber consideration of death to the happy acknowledgement of the unlimited potential of life, from despair to hopefulness, like the passing of angels. Elizabeth presses up against me as we proceed down the aisle. Before we reach him, the judge leans forward and says something to someone on either side of the front row. And so the prosecuting attorney stands up beside me as my best man, while the defense attorney rises and stands before Elizabeth as her full bearded maid of honor. The judge instructs us each in turn. Then digging into my pants pocket and finding only my keys, I experience a moment of real panic that disappears when I find what I'm looking for on the other side. And I give it to him, and then he gives it back to me. As I turn to Elizabeth, she turns too. And I slide the silver ring onto her finger and continue to hold her hand in mine to steady it, both my hand and hers. The judge speaks again as we face him. And then, turning back to one another, we embrace and kiss. And that whole courtroom of strangers, including accused and the accuser, still probably more than a little stunned at their unexpected change of perspective, suddenly erupts in a din of applause and cheers as now wedded and still holding hands, we flee back up the aisle and out that same that same door through which we had first entered. Angels.
There were summer evenings I remember coming up from the barn after a long day's haying, Spencer says, and seeing Elizabeth through the trees before she could see me. Her apron still about her waist, sitting on the porch steps, and with the warm wind blowing through that beautiful straw-colored hair of hers as she watched at the sky already darkening in the east with that faraway look on her face, as if she could still hear the rising and falling tide that she had grown up with, washing up against the bank of the lower meadow. And I never asked her, for I was shy of her answer, and maybe even a little afraid, too, of what she might say. Because I always knew in my heart, as the brutal winters wore on, that she suffered us, our way of life, and maybe not the way of it so much as its grinding harshness. That second winter with that filly of hers, I tried to make her understand well before the mare dropped the foal how it was too late in the year in our country for something to be born. Too late for the little one to be able to gain enough strength to make it through the winter. And how, when such a thing happened, it was always best for both the mama and the little one to do away with the baby, so the mother could recover herself before the really bad cold set in, and not prolong the life of the little one, for no matter how strong it seemed at birth, it would fight a painful battle with winter and lose. For the cold is always that much more powerful than the warm, than the fragile heat of life. But no, she absolutely refused to hear it, refused to even consider what I wanted her to understand, which at the root of it was the very law of the land. Red or one of the other hands happened to be around the barn when the mare went down, shaking and all sweated through. She'd begun to tie up, which is caused somehow by the muscle enzymes going haywire, and for any number of different reasons. And being pregnant, and with her hind end suddenly one big contraction, it had thrown her into labor, too, although she was still a couple of weeks early. We finally get a hold of Stony Walls, our vet, just coming into his dinner, and he comes and goes to work on her. But it seems as if one bad thing follows another. The mare can't really help herself with her muscles seized up like that. And to top it all off, the baby's gonna come breech, which means when the butt is positioned to deliver first instead of the head. Stoney's up inside her trying to get the foal turned around, but it's just no damn good. And all the while, Elizabeth's kneeling close to the mare's head, rubbing her up and down her neck whenever she quiets down some, thrashing about and making those god-awful groaning sounds, and then resting back down again. Stoney gets the little one's rear legs started, with the smoke rising off his bare arms, and then Red and I take over for him so he can have a breather. We sit with our knees against each other, pulling steadily on the foal's legs until we can finally see it's a filly for sure, but it seems to be hung up on something inside the mare, who continues to thrash and grunt against the bed of shavings where she lies. Elizabeth, I say, as I move her hair out of her face, you be right careful, for the poor thing's having an awful time. And then, for 1 second, the way your mind does, her hands on that distressed animal remind me of my mother's hand on my forehead when I was a little boy and had to stay home from school. And then that image jumps all the way into the future and turns back into Elizabeth's hand again, but this time on the forehead of one of our own children, who, as far as I know, hadn't even gotten started yet. Stoney gets between Red and me once again, nudging us off to either side, and he reaches back inside the mare until he gets the foal's one foreleg that was bent and holding it back, freed up the way it needs to be. He continues to pull against its hind legs until suddenly the baby rushes out of her, knocking Stoney on his back and lying on top of him. He finally straightens up with that baby clasped in his arms and just sits there like that. You all right? I asked him. And he tells me he wants whatever blood that's left in the placenta to get into the foal before he cuts it loose from the mama. The mare lies back with her head stretched out so tight, and Stony ties off the cord and then carries the foal into the next stall. Elizabeth's brought him a couple of blankets, and he kneels in the corner with the baby beneath them and his arms around it like before, with its head over his shoulder. And I can still see its lovely little face with its big eyes, blinking with wonder and gloom in the gloom of the barn, as if it were thinking to itself, hang on, I'm out of order here, sorry guys. So this is what the fuss is all about. Elizabeth stays with the baby, and Stony draws off the mare's first milk, and then tube feeds it into the foal through its nostril to be sure she gets all of it into her stomach. It's past 9 o'clock, and I send Red home, for he's got a full day in the morning, and of course I do too. But as it turns out, the night has just begun. When an animal ties up like that, its kidneys will eventually shut down, which will lead to its death. So our only chance of keeping the mare alive is to keep running fluids into her until she's urinating normally, which should indicate that her kidneys are still okay. But then, it's still a damn crapshoot, because if there's been too much muscle damage, she wouldn't be any good for herself anyway. Stony had come prepared for the long haul when we described to him over the phone what was happening. And so he'd brought with him several cases of those electrolyte fluid bags, along with a week's supply of milk replacement for the baby. And he gets himself all set up like he knows that tomorrow's a hell of a long ways off. But he still intends to be there with the mare alongside him. And that they'll both see the morning together. He sews the catheter into her jugular vein and then hangs the first of the clear plastic bags from a hook he's screwed into the overhead beam. Then he attaches a long, transparent tube that goes from the bottom of the bag into the portal at the mare's neck. And I watch with him for a few minutes as the liquid begins to drip and fall. Elizabeth's mixed up a batch of that milk replacement, and she's got a baby bottle of it with a rubber nipple, and she's sitting in the next stall talking to the foal and rubbing its forehead and trying to get it interested in what she's got to offer. I kneel down with her and tell her that I'll get the baby started, and she could get Stony some dinner, which reminds me that we hadn't had our own either yet. And she goes off. Well, the baby keeps nosing around the bottle in my hand, and with that wonderful soft skin of the newborn. And I'm setting up against her as Elizabeth had been, and probably mumbling some of that same foolishness in the foal's ear, as I watched her eyes wide and new. And her eyelashes, when she blinks, somehow make me smile. She finally gets it in her mind to try what's behind the nipple and begins drawing at it, with those lovely eyes of hers going back and forth, and every now and again looking right at me. Looks to me like she's found her daddy, Stony says. And I look up to see him standing against the opening to the stall with his arms crossed on his chest, and a big smile on that mug of his. The mare's quiet, he says. We'll keep the fluids to her as long as it takes. Will she eat anything, I ask him. And he says, oh, she'll nibble at some grain every now and again, but she's not real interested. The baby takes another bottle of the milk substitute and then puts its chin on its knee and closes its eyes and goes to sleep. And I move away and close the stall door real quiet like, so it'll take its rest. We all eat in the runway between the stalls, with Stony periodically checking on the mare. He's got 3 of those fluid bags strung up together and hanging there, so it gives us time to eat our dinner. But while we're still at it, there's a thrashing from the baby stall, and we look at her, just beginning to get her legs. She gets her hind legs under her, and nearly locked, and pauses like that, quivering. But when she goes to rise up, Off of her elbow, she rocks back and falls over. Stoney's gone back to the mare, and Elizabeth goes in on the foal. She'll do her, I say, standing back and watching. For it's always been a miracle to me, the birth, and then seeing them make themselves stand upright, and soon, after bouncing and jumping around like they'd been practicing their locomotion for months instead of just hours. Elizabeth crouches in the corner beside the little thing, as it somehow forces itself back into the same position, pushing up its hind legs all a-quiver, and with its little tail sucked right flat against its butt. Elizabeth slides her open hands under its belly, not hardly touching it, and as it pushes up from its front and starts over again, she supports it underneath so that all four legs are straight and locked. It hesitates for a moment, still trembling with its new little muscles that only an hour ago had been what it only needed to paddle with in the warm, safe waters of the womb. And then it extends one foreleg for its first step. But before getting it accomplished, it pitches forward and dives woefully onto its face. Don't take very much to learn how to fall, Stoney says quietly beside me. But the getting back up again, I say. Well, the will to get back up. Aye, Stoney says, for each and every one of us, I reckon. And inside myself I say, Amen. And then again, Amen. We get Stoney all fixed up with a pillow and that ancient great-grandma's quilt that must weigh 14 or 15 pounds at least. Elizabeth feeds her filly again, which had been sleeping on its side, weary from that hard journey it had been traveling that evening. All the way from that far inland sea, which is all it had ever known, before being cast up on a rough and fearful shore. And then, more wondrous than frightening, amid the quiet hours of myriad discovery, it had found itself not sea creature at all, but something apparently unsuited to its new environment. A fragile, tottering, stick-legged thing, having known its first hunger and then perhaps its first independent dream, too, of unimagined places where its legs once they worked more harmoniously might take it. For it had finally managed its first few precarious steps, and known warmth again after its startling discovery of the cold, and recovered the darkness too after its incomprehensible discovery of the light. And there appeared to be many mothers for its choosing, none that slept beside it just then, but many kindly mothers nonetheless. Stoney tells Elizabeth that he'll feed the baby through the night as long as he's right there, for she'll no longer have such a luxury after he leaves. But no, she says. She reckons where she'll be in that baby's stall every 2 hours for the next 3 days. And then she'll proceed from there onward until the poor little thing is ready for weaning. And I can see right then and there that this whole event is about to provide an actual treasure of learning for someone. And as I walk back up to the house by myself, I figure that I'm probably the one that's about to be re-educated. For Elizabeth seems to know just precisely where this whole affair is headed. And I'll be damned if she isn't up and down all night long those first few days. And when the filly can finally go for 4 whole hours between feedings, it almost seems like a vacation, at least to me and our alarm clock. Like when you get a spate from 20 or 30 below zero weather, and it sets in real good and firm sometime after the new year. Why, a rise to, say, 5 below zero is near to almost being downright tropical. And a day that actually makes it all the way back to zero, so you're neither on the plus nor the minus, why, that's practically shirt-sleeve weather. Making you wonder as you leave the house if you really do need your coat or not. And although you've still got nearly 5 months to go, you know that spring is absolutely inevitable. And hellfire, why, a man's hopefulness can just about soar on rosy new wings unfettered. I've already finished shaving and I'm nearly dressed when the alarm goes off for the 6 o'clock feeding. I tell Elizabeth that I'll take care of that one, and I'll see her by supper time. I guess she'd fix Stony some food at the 4 o'clock, and as I enter the barn, all is quiet. I creep past the baby's stall and see that she's asleep with her legs stretched out straight, as if she were dreaming of standing squarely upright. And then I look in at the mare and Stony, and I'll be, I whisper to myself. The lights over each of the stalls are off, but the ones that are spaced further apart over the runway are still on. The last one is opposite the mare's stall, so that the baby lies in near darkness, while a dim half-light spreads over most of Stony and the mama. He's got the fluid dripping at a slower rate, and of the 3 bags that hang there, she's almost finished with the second one. A couple of empty plates are stacked on top of each other and pushed off to one side with a fork laid across them. And Stony is setting in the bedding shavings with his back leaning away from the wooden partition and his legs out before him, and with the mare's face lying across his lap. He's still got the quilt wrapped about his shoulders, but it's nearly fallen off one side of him. His left arm turned away from the horse, with the fingers of that hand almost touching a saucer that holds an empty teacup, as if he had just had time to set it down before sleep had finally overtaken him, in mid-stride, so to speak. His other arm lies across the mare's neck, and his face rests on her head, and they're both sound asleep. All God's creatures, I think, as I stand there watching them, and the beauty of it, of the oneness of all life, just about freezes me so that I am almost afraid that if I blink, I might disturb them. All God's creatures. Family.
Oh my goodness. I could not have picked 2 better readers for this. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Joe Henry kind of knows how to write a thing, I must say. And you certainly did it justice. I'm so pleased that you would read that.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's just beautiful. And I would encourage people, if they're interested, to turn in to the 3rd Wednesday of July at the same time for the words of Grace Paley for something incredibly different. She's an activist and a feminist, and we've got 2 stories. One of her early life with her children and an ex-husband and a lover and bad children, and the other story of the same characters 20 years later, read by my friend Tessa Nelson, who's an actor in Denver, and by the incomparable Jeannie Walla.
Tell Tessa I was denied the opportunity to read that.
All right, here's true confession. I sent John the wrong story and just fixed it last week because I sent him one of the Grace Paley stories, and he never even said, "What are you, nuts? I'm reading this Jewish feminist what?" And I'm really glad I found that out
Not for anything.
now. Aren't you?
Yeah, right. Oh, God.
It wasn't good. But John, you were a saint to consider reading that because it would have been a stretch.
I'll try anything 3 times.
Okay, I'll give you Grace Paley again sometime.
Come on.
Ow! Well, thank you so much. And thank you, as always, to Pitkin County Library and to the lovely Thunder River Theater and the incomparable Sean Jeffries, who makes us look good, even though my lighting is really bad. We'll look for you again. Huh?
Janice, is that a gray blanket behind you, or?
No, it's blue. And this
Oh,
is
it's
my
okay.
basement. And this is what's behind it is boxes and stuff.
You need like a blue screen with you like flying through
There
me
you go.
with like.
Thank you, John. You're just an expert on so many things. That's
I
why I
know.
love you.
Lee, I enjoyed your
Yeah.
reading, Lee. Thank you for.
Oh, yeah, and likewise, sir. Yeah, just love to just mind delve into the words you were giving out. That was, yeah.
Yeah.
It's,
At
yeah.
page 5, I had a printer breakdown, and I lost one line off the top of my sheet, which I hurriedly scribbled onto another sheet. So that sorry about that, but
No worries.
mm.
Yeah, I
Strange
equipped my
happen
printer with
in Literature Out Loud.
cartridge. It was it's good to be able to read my print. Yeah, especially his words, man. And is Joe Henry still alive?
I
And
think
still
so,
writing?
but nobody ever sees him
Why?
because he's a recluse.
Okay, the recluse type. Got it. Yeah, a male recluse.
Yes.
I'm just impressed you're operating without eyewear.
I would normally have them, but I had just the right amount of light out of that window, and the font size and the ink depth was okay. So I was happy.
Good on you, brother.
Janice,
What?
how long has Literature Out Loud been rolling here now?
10 years.
Pure decade, man.
But it has only been virtual through the good graces of Thunder River Theater since the bad disease happened.
Yeah.
What was that?
It's something you never heard of it, John. You're a vet. You don't know. Get out.
Too funny.
Get out.
I had a baby last year. I'm completely well, I didn't personally have a baby, but we had a baby, and yeah, that's a healthy distraction through a pandemic. Let me tell you.
And she's a beautiful baby.
She is indeed.
I've gotten to hold her, which makes me pretty happy.
Well,
Lovely. Yeah.
Okay, we gotta let Sean go to bed, and then he'll let us all three of us come back.
he better.
Oh, okay.
But he'll let all these other people go away, and then we can say even worse things.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Sean.